stay on time. Hi, my name's Fiona Blandford. I'm a community organiser at BirdLife Australia. Thank you so much, everybody, for calling in today from across the country. We've got people calling in from all parts of the country. Thanks so much for calling in to hear about our BirdLife Swift Parrot and Nature Laws campaign during the time of coronavirus. We're really honoured that so many people could join us today. We understand everyone is really busy and that it's been a really intense time for us all. The restrictions are starting to ease now around the country, which is great, but please continue to look after yourself. Before continuing, I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, borders and culture. We'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd love to introduce you to our campaigns team and my co-host today. We've got Erin Farley on the line. Hi Erin, how you going?
Hi, can you, do I come up when I talk now?
You do come up, you get a yellow frame around your box.
Amazing to see you all.
We've also got Andrew Hunter online, our conservation campaigner. Hi Andrew, how you going?
Good,
cool.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Cool, we've got Denise. Hi Denise from Gingerbite. So great to see everyone jumping into the box there. So today we have a chat box happening on the side. I've emailed a lot of you and most of you who registered as of midnight last night that we were asking for questions up front, but we do have a chat box happening on the side, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the day. We'll try to get to them. Erin and Andrew will both be monitoring the chat box, but if we don't get to everybody today, we'll come back to you in the next couple of days, or contact us at conservation@birdlife.org.au, which Erin will drop into the chat box now, but you'll hear from us again. Sorry, I'm looking at you down there. I'm going to start looking up here so I can actually look at you. So today we're going to be recording the session also. So if you have to leave early, that's fine. We're going to have it on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So please jump over there and check it out. Everyone's on mute today. So again, anything, put that in the Dropbox. If you can all leave your video on, that would be awesome. It's really great to see everybody. It's just a great way to feel connected to everybody here. If you're eating your lunch, that's fine. It's just great to know that everyone's around and supporting us in this campaign. It's a really exciting time now for swift parrots. They're on their way back from Tasmania. They're coming off their long migration across the Bass Strait. I heard yesterday, I hope I don't steal your thunder here, Dean, but I heard yesterday that someone in Melbourne saw a flock of 30 fly over. He was on his roof bird watching. That's what you do during lockdown. And he saw them fly over in Melbourne. So heading north, so just fantastic that they're coming back. Also, we're going to be hearing a lot today about the swift parrot. You're also going to be hearing a lot about how you can help with our campaign and also, with what's going on with swift parrots. Because we feel at this point in time, if there isn't a change, we need a change. Like the prediction is that within 15 years, we could lose this species. It's a really grim prediction, but we think we've got the power to change this. And now is a really critical time. For those of you living in Eden Monaro, there's a by-election coming up, but also this is a nature laws review year. Many of you will know on the line about that. We believe that our nature laws should protect our birds and species and their homes and habitat, but they're just not at the moment. They're not strong enough. And we think with all of us on the line here today, we're going to give you some actions to take after today. There's going to be a link that's going to drop in the Dropbox now. Thanks, Erin. Click on that, earmark it for later. Andrew Hunter will be coming back and talking to that at the end of this webinar today. So something that just didn't affect us, didn't affect locals in the southern New South Wales area, but affected all of us across the country this year. Whether it was huddled on beaches, protecting their families themselves from the fires, or if it was all of us across the country breathing in smoke hundreds of kilometres away. We all witnessed it via media coverage, but we witnessed a devastating bushfire season this year. And what that did, I think, for all of us, many things, but one of the things was that it became clear in our minds that birds and animals and their habitat were at risk before, but they're really at risk now and into the future. And they're also more important and precious now than they were before. So we've organised this awesome panel of speakers today. I'd like to introduce you to them in a second, but first we're just going to go through what the purpose of today is to let you know about the swift parrot, a little bit about its habitat for you that don't know, and what's going on with its migration at the moment. We're going to be hearing from some locals in the southern New South Wales region and also from Tasmania. And then you're going to hear about some of the bushfire recovery work that BirdLife Australia has been doing from the amazing amount of the donations that came in, generous donations that came in this year. So, and then we're going to let you know what you can all do from across the country to bring the spotlight back to threatened species. So the panel, just in the next couple of minutes, I'd love to introduce you to the panel, starting with Dean Ingwersen calling in from Melbourne. Dean is our BirdLife Woodland Bird Program Leader and also our Regent Honeyeater Recovery Coordinator. Hi Dean, how are you going and what's going on with you in lockdown at the moment?
I'm busier than ever. We've got a lot of stuff on the go, lots of planning for post-COVID life, and yeah, it's interesting times, but also quite exciting. I think there's lots of good things that we can still do, and we'll work through that today. So hopefully we can affect some positive change.
Awesome, thank you, Dean. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Webb from ANU's Fenner School of Environment and Society, and also from the Difficult Bird Research Group from Tassie. Hi, how you going? How's everything in Tas, and how's lockdown been for you, Matt? You're on mute at the moment. Sorry, Matt.
Sorry. Yeah, it's probably been quite similar to to a lot of people's experience. And I think most of us will be pretty glad when it's over. Yeah. It's a nice day down here today, though. Getting lots of sun.
Beautiful. I can see that all radiating around you there. It looks lovely. Cheers. Thank you so much. And I'd love to introduce you to Harriet Swift, who's a forest campaigner or has an awesome last name from the Southeast Region Conservation Alliance from Bega there. Harriet, yeah, we're going to hear more from you later, but what inspired you to become a forest campaigner?
Ooh, that goes back a long way. But like a lot of people, it started when the forest next door to me on the far south coast of New South Wales was logged. And that was over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I've been doing it ever since.
Thank you. Thank you for all your awesome work. I'm looking forward to hearing from you a little bit later. We also have Oisin Sweeney somewhere amongst, I can't see you up top, Oisin, but I know you're somewhere. How are you going? Oisin is from our BirdLife Shoalhaven branch. He's an ecologist on the committee there. An amazing career as an ecologist, but also a career change in the last year. Can you tell us a bit about that, Oisin?
Yeah, well, I can. The career change is not entirely related to birds and or swift parrots. I've opened a brewery. I'm a partner in a brewery called Jervis Bay Brewing Company now. But as you said, I'm still on the BirdLife Shoalhaven committee. So birds have always been my kind of favourite thing in the ecological sphere, and that remains the case, although I am a bit of a generalist when it comes to ecology. I have a fair bit of experience with the forests, not anywhere near the likes of Harriet and some other, you know, really long-term, tenacious, awesome campaigners, but I worked on forests for several years in my last position with the National Parks Association, where I was the senior ecologist there. So I understand the issue pretty well and the challenges facing swift parrots and all the other species that rely on intact forests, and particularly the older features of forests, such as the big old trees that are so important for swift parrots for their increased blossom production.
Great, thank you so much, Oisin. I look forward to hearing more from you later also. To get started today, I'm going to bring Dean back to the conversation. Dean, can you give us a bit of an overview of the swift parrot and their migration and what's going on with their habitat right now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Fan. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. I guess I'll start by setting the scene. Swift parrots are as Aussie as a bird or an animal can get. You know, they're as Australian as koalas, kangaroos, they're nowhere else on the planet. So if we don't save them here, they disappear forever. They are a part of our living national heritage. They have this really fascinating ecology. They breed in Tasmania over spring and summer, and I'll leave Matt to talk about the Tasmanian stuff. But you think about a small parrot that breeds down there, they then fly across Bass Strait during autumn, and they spend autumn and winter on the mainland. And when they arrive on the mainland, they're on the hunt for food. So conditions in Tasmania get too harsh, so they've evolved this strategy to come to the mainland and look for food over here. And so they spend the autumn and winter months on the mainland from southeast South Australia through Victoria, mainly central and northeast Victoria, and then up through New South Wales, and they get up as far as southeast Queensland in the Brisbane sort of vicinity. Those birds that end up that far north up around Brisbane, they do about a 3,500 kilometre round trip in a year to get from Tasmanian breeding grounds and back again. So they are the longest known migrating parrot in the world. So it's kind of another tick in terms of how unique they are. The other thing that's really fascinating is that, yes, they're called a parrot, but they kind of act more like a lorikeet. They've got a brush-tipped tongue, and they've evolved really well to life, feeding on nectar coming out of flowering gum trees across the landscape. The other thing that they do as well, obviously nectar out of flowering trees is really important, but I'll get one tiny little bit of show and tell for those who can see this. I'll hold it up. But those little white snowflakes on this leaf here are what's called lerp. Lerp are like the secretions that come out of the back end of sap-sucking insects called psyllids. And this lerp is a really critical resource as well. So as well as being tied to flowering and nectar, you'll often see swifties like zipping leaves through their beaks and gleaning that lerp. One of the fascinating things is that a lot of those nectar feeders, like lorikeets, are really big and bossy, try and dominate areas. Swift parrots tend to be found with smaller, not quite as aggressive species when you see them, particularly on the mainland. So things like smaller honeyeaters, white-naped honeyeaters, yellow-faced. If we're very lucky, for me in my work, a Regent honeyeater, that's like an absolute bonza day when you get the two of those in the same spot. But they occur in both coastal and inland settings through the mainland. The inland habitats that we tend to find them associated with are things like red ironbark, mugger ironbark, grey box, white box, and yellow box. And when those trees are flowering really well and there's lots of nectar coming out, they're very important. In the coastal areas through that range, they tend to be found more in swamp mahogany, forest red gum, black butt to a degree, but spotted gum. And that's something we'll talk about during today, is the importance of spotted gum, particularly in forestry. They tend to favour remnants, but they will use parks, gardens, street trees, depending on when the resources are available and where they're available. Swift parrots are a really typical conservation story. They've lost lots of habitat, and I guess the catalyst for today is talking about the ongoing loss that they're still suffering. But forestry is obviously a big issue, particularly in Tasmania in the breeding area. But we've got historical loss of habitat through the agricultural zone, and there are pockets of really important stuff still, I guess, under the eye of developers and residential expansion. Going forward, there's also going to be that issue of rural tree health, decline, paddock trees, patches of remnants, and those isolated areas. We also know on the mainland they do suffer a bit from some of those bigger, bossier honeyeaters, so noisy miners and other things that tend to dominate patches. And I guess that kind of pervasive threat that everything's facing now is drought and climate change. We need water flowing into systems to be able to trigger those flowering events and that nectar flow. So in those years where we have really low nectar output as a result of really harsh environmental conditions, that's when things do get difficult for the species. At the moment, as well as my role at BirdLife, I'm chair of the National Swift Parrot Recovery Team. That's an effort that's been on the go since the mid-1990s. Sadly, since then, I guess the species has still continued to track in the wrong direction. And as a result, they're now listed as critically endangered. So they're one step from extinct in the wild. So it's pretty dire. A lot of our work these days is focused on the threats that we can manage and all the things that we're learning about as we go. So Matt's lab has picked up on sugar glider predation. So that's one aspect of what we're trying to do at a recovery team level. But there's also all these other issues such as forestry and loss of habitat restoration and so on. In terms of the mainland, we've had an extensive amount of volunteer assistance over the years to help us track movements. And from that, we've been able to demonstrate or work out which areas are important for the species. In some instances these days, that's changing a little bit, but as long as resources are right in an area, you get flowering, swift parrots will often come back to the same sites again and again. So there is variation from year to year. We'll have years where they don't turn up much in central Victoria, for example, but if the grey box flowers really well, they will turn up, and they'll turn up in big numbers. Those coastal areas these days we tend to consider a little bit more as coastal refuges, or we had thought of, but they are becoming increasingly important. If I think of somewhere like, or a year like 2002, we had really bad flowering across the inland divide. They concentrated in the Central Coast in hundreds of birds through the Central Coast region foraging on flowering swamp mahogany. If we think about the South Coast forests with that beautiful spotted gum forest, in 2009, we couldn't find swifties until the middle of June. And a colleague and I did a road trip based on some intel from some of the people online here. And we found half the population scattered between kind of Bateman's Bay and Merimbula through these spotted gum forests. One of the people online, Julie, who's helped us out a lot on the South Coast, a couple of years later, in a single location in the spotted gum forest, she found 1,200 birds. So 60% of the swift parrots in a single location at one point in time. So at times they're quite dispersed through the landscape, but particularly as they head back to Tasmania, we think they can congregate around these really important areas. So we're putting in a lot of effort to try and save the bird, as I said, through activities such as ongoing monitoring, identifying these key areas, looking at population viability analysis. What are the trajectories for the species? But the outlook at the moment with this continued pressure is not great. We really do need to do something about that loss of habitat.
Thank you for that, Dean. We'll come back to you in a couple of minutes to let us know a bit more about some of the work we're proposing to do in that area. And I'd love to bring Matthew. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you let us know a little bit about what's happening in Tasmania in the swift parrot habitat at the moment and how it's going down there? You guys have had fires also, so just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and yes, they're copping it wherever they are, whether it's on the mainland or Tasmania. Just for people who aren't familiar with what the birds do in Tasmania, I'll just give you a quick sort of rundown on why they can't come down here. But getting back to what Dean just pointed out about the birds aggregating a lot of the time, it's worth sort of just mentioning Tasmania is the only place that they breed, and it's not all of Tasmania, and they're really specialised in terms of the food. In terms of food, that yes, lerps and a whole lot of other leaf invertebrates are important, but breeding is key to the birds breeding is flowering of just 2 eucalypts, so blue gums and black gums. They'll forage in other flowers as well, but we just haven't picked up ever really picked up significant breeding anywhere that there isn't a flowering event. And so we've been tracking where the birds have been breeding for, well, I've been doing it for a bit over 15 years. But it's essentially the birds need tree hollows for nesting in trees that are, you're talking at least, generally 150 years old, but the majority of nesting trees would be 300 plus years old. Many of them, who knows, 500 plus. And they're increasingly rare features in the landscape. But another sort of thing that makes it harder for them to get by down here is they also need the food source within foraging range of the nest. So one without the other doesn't. It's not available effectively. So a whole lot of flowering where there's no hollows close enough to where the food is, that's not available for breeding, and it works the opposite way around.
So what are some of the threats down there, Matt?
Yeah, so similar to the mainland, historically there's just been a massive loss of habitat, and that means really what we're dealing with is just the remnants of what was once here. But it makes every last bit really that much more important. But on top of the fact that we're just dealing with remnants, and it's a really small area if you put it all together, because it's highly fragmented, and often these fine-scale features that they rely on occur at low densities across the landscape as well. But because of the flowering patterns of blue gum and black gum, blue gum in particular, it means generally, well, it is the norm for only a fraction of remaining breeding habitat to actually be functional, or to be available in any particular year. And yeah, I think a lot of people would be quite surprised at just how little is actually available in many years. And the fact that we're still losing some of these areas, because what's available each year shifts in space. It'll be one region in one year, a couple of regions in the next year, but they're in different locations. And the fact that we're knowingly removing habitat is just something we've really got to. We have to stop it.
Yeah.
Now, if we're serious about preventing the extinction of these birds, there isn't really any. There's no room to move anymore, and then so that's occurring obviously through logging, land clearing, developments, but then throw fires into that mix, and it's all of a sudden becomes quite scary.
Yeah.
So the scale of the kind of fires that we're starting to experience now, and it's not just in the last couple of years. The Finale fire, which I'm sure a lot of people would have heard of back in 2013, I think. The size of that fire, the extent of it, that actually covered probably a larger area than what the entire population might rely on in particular years. So it's kind of, you sort of see the level of scale, the threat there, which just makes it, you know, there's not as much we can actually do about the fire scenario directly, but it just really highlights the importance of retaining everything that's left, and also letting younger forest grow on to become suitable habitat.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much for that. It's a good segue into bringing Harriet into the conversation here. You guys chatting to everyone online yesterday, doing a bit of a practice run. It was just great to hear that you guys talk about your experiences on the Tasmania end and also what's been happening in the southern New South Wales coast area. So Harriet, you know, you guys have had a massive time there, probably beyond this year also, but knowing this is the biggest year for fires has been in a long time. But how's it going in the community? And yeah, what have you noticed that's going on in some of those burnt areas now?
Well, in some of the burnt areas, they've just started logging again. That's just hard to contemplate, but they have. We had a very catastrophic summer bushfire season. 80% of the forest available for logging on the South Coast was burnt. But in spite of that, the Forestry Corporation has recently decided that it's business as usual, and they're back in there again. I happened to go to a webinar yesterday by Professor David Lindenmayer about logging and bushfires, and he made it very clear that the worst thing that you can possibly do after a fire like that is to start logging again, and that's exactly what they're doing. I couldn't help noticing Dean's comment about the 2009 visit of the swift parrots to the South Coast region. That was also the year in which the Forestry Corporation decided to log Bermagui State Forest. And there were over 1,000 swift parrots there at the time. The response of the Forestry Corporation was to say, we'll save 5 trees per hectare for them, which sounds bad enough. But what happened in practice was that they saved exactly the same 5 trees that they were saving for every other species, threatened species in the forest. So they were just putting another label on the same trees that were already being saved. So it was a completely meaningless provision for them. And these things all add up. They are very serious over the years. I've been doing this now for over 20 years, but that's when I first started, there had already been 30 years of wood chipping. That's changed the forest enormously over that time. It's made the forests more fire prone. It's made them younger, drier, more even aged, even height. And we saw the result of that in the recent summer bushfires. The border fire, which travelled from the Victorian border to Eden in a single day, burnt through some of the most heavily logged forest in the country, which had been intensively logged for wood chips over many decades. And we paid the price for that over that summer. It was not just the trees that were burnt, but you know, 1 billion wild creatures that needed those trees as habitat were lost in those fires. But we had 2 weeks to recover from all that before the coronavirus started.
So how does that feel? Like you're sitting inside now, like I'm sure everyone wants to get outside and see what's happening, and what's happening from the South Coast Alliance perspective? Like, what are your conversations like at the moment? I mean, as restrictions are easing also, so there's some plans or...
Well, our big challenge now is the resumption of logging, which is not just a return to business as usual. It's actually going to be worse than that, because the chip mill, which is the driver of all logging in the region, has recently applied for a development approval to expand its operations. And they have that application currently before the Bega Valley Shire Council to set up 3 new mills there, processing different products from saw logs to pulp logs to briquettes. So they'll become, if this gets up, the monopoly buyer of every single tree logged in the entire region. It's actually very serious, and it's really hard to do much about it in these current circumstances.
Yeah.
I'm trying.
Yeah, it's made a lot of our work really difficult. Matt, I saw you wanted to add something to what Harriet was saying there. You're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute. That you mute there, Matt.
Sorry. Yeah, in relation to, you're pointing out how you had so much of the population in one area, and the same sort of scenario happens in Tasmania, and it just makes them so much more vulnerable to, to whatever disturbances or threats are occurring. But in Tasmania, and this has been going on for longer than I've been working on the birds, but it is not unusual to come across active logging when you have an aggregation of nesting birds, and coop sizes are generally a bit smaller these days, and technically that stuff shouldn't be being logged anyway, but it's still, although it's not at the scale that it was 10, 20 years ago, the densities that the birds often nest in, and that's a lot of the time by choice, but increasingly just necessity, because that's all that's left. But a 100-hectare coop might have, could have anywhere from 20 to 50 nests in it potentially, and these have regularly been being harvested when birds are actually nesting in them. So on top of the loss of the long-term loss of that, we're also effectively, we have been destroying nests.
Yeah. I might actually bring Oisin in here. This is a good segue. Sorry, I'm just a bit aware of time. Also, thank you so much, both of you. Oisin, living in an area on the south coast that was, I guess you could say, spared from the fires, but you were surrounded by them. What's going on in the healthy habitat there with the spotted gum, and also what's some of the work that the BirdLife Shoalhaven branch have been doing in the last couple of months?
Yeah, so you're right. Our local area, the Bay and Basin area, was largely spared from the fires. They got pretty close, but they sort of went around us. And the consequence of that is that the unburnt areas that are dominated by spotted gum are absolutely loaded with birds. They have been for several weeks now. and as well as that, we've noticed a huge influx of flying foxes. So they're not typically very common around our area, and they're extremely common at the moment. So it's pretty clear that the unburnt areas are being sought as refuges by a big variety of bird species and the bats as well. I guess to build on the habitat threat theme, one of the more ironic things that we've experienced in our area is just a little further south, still in the Shoalhaven, but in a little place called Honeyeater. One of the unburnt areas of forests actually had a development application approval over it, and the developer was set to clear it just last week. So ironically, one of the small patches of forest that was spared by the fires on the entire South Coast, if the fire wasn't going to get it, a developer, it was earmarked for development. So I think that just highlights the multiple threats that forests and swift parrot habitat faces on in the coastal zone. In regards to the large street trees that Dean mentioned, the Shoalhaven, I can't really speak for any other LGAs, but certainly in the Shoalhaven, we have a particularly laissez-faire approach to managing village trees and urban trees, and they're being lost. Big mature trees are being lost at a very rapid rate, which is sad to see as well. So, so there's a bit of a triple threat in that regard. Now, in regards our branch, the big ticket item for the branch at the moment is monitoring for post-fire recovery. I can't claim any of the credit for that because I've actually become a teacher. It's my next career move. I'm a homeschooler by day now, but that ends on Monday, so I'll be back out in the bush a little bit. So my access to the bush has been hyper-local. But there have been about 30 odd people taking part in that post-fire bushfire recovery program. They're monitoring about 100 sites on the 2 hectare time search method. And some of those sites are new and some have been well established for many years. Now, one of the things that came up at our last branch meeting was that a lot of species of interest aren't picked up at the moment, and because the Australian government and BirdLife have put a lot of new species potentially on the threatened species list as a result of the bushfire, we are looking at ways in which the people that are out in the bush monitoring can actually try to record some of those species too. So swift parrot could tie in very nicely on that front. Yeah, I think that's probably the most relevant bit from our branch.
Yep. I might come back to you in a couple of minutes just to find out what you think people on the coast want in the future when it comes to, you know, you presented a couple of good ideas and some solutions the other day from a nature solutions front, and yeah, I'd like to hear a bit more about that. I'm going to bring in Dean Ingwersen here. Dean, what's some of the work that BirdLife Australia have been doing in the last couple of months since the bushfires and since like some amazing amount of generous donations that have come in?
Yeah, look, I mean, most of the focus initially with anything that happens like the scale that we saw with those fires is kind of an assessment. So that was the immediate response, is to look at, you know, particularly once the fires had stopped, you know, what's the footprint of the fire, and then you overlay that with the distribution of the various species that we have through those regions, and it's a real quick, you know, desktop analysis to look at, you know, which species have been hit hardest by those fires, and that's kind of a way by which we can set an agenda to try and help recovery of those species that, you know, BirdLife might be engaged in doing, or trying to guide investment from you know, various levels of government to some sort of, you know, bushfire recovery work. I mean, if you think about swift parrots, there's some of the work that we've done. I should say some of the work that we've done so far is just desktop. So there's areas that we still haven't been into to get and have a look at because of, you know, safety and then the COVID restrictions and so on. You know, not every fire is the same. So some areas that show up on fire maps as burnt might have been patchily burnt, but you know, we know that some of those South Coast forests, some of the Blue Mountains areas have just been absolutely incinerated. So, you know, the estimation at the moment is potentially, you know, 30% of usable swifty habitat on the mainland in some areas has been impacted. And I think I'll touch on a point or reflect, I can't remember who made it before, might have been Matt, but with a loss of so much habitat from fire, it makes those remaining unburnt habitats even more valuable than they were 6 months ago. You know, by default, these areas that are burnt are now unusable. So it's really important that we know where those sites are and what we can do to make sure that they are preserved. So yeah, we're just getting back into swifty areas now with some of those restrictions easing. It's kind of been one of the frustrations it's been nice to get reports of birds flying over people's roofs in Melbourne, but not knowing ultimately where they're ending up at the moment. So that'll kind of be a priority for us over the next couple of months to start getting people mobilised to search these areas where they might be occurring. But we're also doing other work on other species. So Regent Honeyeater is working in collaboration with ANU to do kind of post-fire assessments of sites where they breed. I know some of our colleagues have been liaising with the Northern Eastern Bristlebird working group around you know, what the management options will be for that species going forward. We've been working with La Trobe University here in Melbourne, kind of designing a study around superb lyrebirds, you know, with an estimate of potentially 50% of their range on the mainland impacted. What's that doing to them, and what defines or what constitutes a refuge for them? And then we've got a new project starting in East Gippsland very shortly that I'm helping to co-manage, which is putting nest box resources back into areas where we think that they're going to be a limiting resource now going forward. So there's a bit happening to try and address this stuff.
Awesome. Thanks for letting us know that, Dean. That's great. Now, I know we've got a few questions coming in, but I might just bring Andrew Hunter in quickly just to let us know about the campaign, Swift Parrot and Nature Laws campaign we're running at the moment, and some of the actions you can take today. And then, yeah, we'd love to take some questions. We've got lots of questions coming in. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Fee, and thank you to all of our great speakers today. It's been very informative for me too. Before I start talking about BirdLife Australia's new campaign, I just wanted to quickly share with you the story of the first time I saw a swift parrot. It was a few years ago on the grounds of La Trobe University in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And I've been going for a few days in a row trying to catch a glimpse of a flash of green and just had no luck. And then the last day I went out, I was with a fellow bird watcher, and we happened to see a group of 3 swift parrots feeding on some flowering eucalypts. And I just remember feeling just so excited and also privileged to see this, you know, such amazing, beautiful and rare bird. But unfortunately that joy didn't last long, because I also knew that unless things change, we will lose the species in 15 years. So it was a very bittersweet memory for me. But just, you know, listening to the speakers today, hearing from Dean and Matt about their amazing conservation work, and from Oisin and Harriet from their community actions, I'm full of hope. And I'm really full of hope just from the overwhelming support that we have from supporters like you, where we have, you know, hundreds of people joining us today on a Friday lunchtime webinar just to hear about swift parrots and what we all can do to protect them. That's really inspiring. So thank you so much for taking some time today. So BirdLife Australia, we will officially launch our campaign to protect swift parrots forever. And that starts today, and we will need everyone online here to take action. As we've heard today, swift parrots, they do face numerous challenges throughout their lives, but as Matt and Dean and others have spoken today, the greatest threat to their survival is completely unnecessary. Their homes across their range are open to native logging and forestry operations. In Tasmania, as Matt was saying, extensive areas of their known breeding habitat are logged, where we're actually losing the nest of these critically endangered species. And we hold serious concerns that even more areas of this breeding habitat could be opened up for logging, as a moratorium in these areas ended in April of this year. And as Matt said, this is the only place in the world where these birds can breed and raise their young. So really, the fate of the swift parrot ultimately lies with the forest of Tasmania, and we must protect what remains. Meanwhile, on the south coast of New South Wales, logging in native forest still occurs. And as Oisin said, that this is happening in areas that were spared by the fires and are acting as refuge for swift parrot and other wildlife. So we must protect this remaining area. It should be a conservation priority as we move forward. So having said that, our campaign will focus on protecting swift parrot habitat in these two critical points in the migratory route in Tasmania and New South Wales. And if you live in either of these states, we'll be following up with you in the next couple weeks with some direct actions that you can take at both the local and state level to protect parrot habitat and their beautiful forest homes. While our campaign does focus on these two states, New South Wales and Tasmania, we also understand and are really excited that so many of you calling in today don't live in these states. You're calling from other states or territories. And we want to be able to give you the opportunity to take part in this campaign. So that leads us to what we can all do today. And I did see a question earlier in the chat box about is BirdLife putting in a submission to the EPBC, our nature laws review. And as Fiona alluded to earlier, our national nature laws, the EPBC Act, or the Environmental Protection and Conservation Biodiversity Conservation Act, is currently under review. And this year, we have the opportunity to change our national nature laws so they will protect the birds like swift parrots in the places we love forever. We expect an interim report for this review to be released with some key recommendations later next month. And then a final report will be tabled later this year or early next year. And that will present the federal parliament with the opportunity to consider new national nature laws. So right now, we need to build the political support for strengthening these national nature laws. And we need everyone online today to reach out to all of our federal MPs, asking them to be a champion for stronger nature laws. So I think Erin posted this in the chat box earlier, but we have a simple action link. So Erin, can you pop that back onto, oh, you've already done it, just so it's on everyone's screens. So if you look in the chat box, if you look on your Zoom on the bottom menu, there should be an option that says chat box. If you click that, it will open up the chat box and you should see the latest link, which is a link to our Act for Birds campaign page, which is actforbirds.org/protect swift parrot. And here we've created a simple action for everyone to directly email your federal MP. All you need to do is fill out the form with your name and your postcode, so we'll target the proper member. And we do ask that you personalize these emails just for greater impact. You will see about halfway down through the email in brackets, we have a question asking you to write a few sentences about why you care about this issue and why you want stronger nature laws for swift parrots. But it's not just swift parrots that are affected by our weak national nature laws, it's other threatened species. So if you have a particular species that holds a special place in your heart, or even a place that you want protected forever, please add a few sentences here too, just so your local MP knows why this is so important to you. And please, after you've completed this action, you don't have to do it right now, just save that link and you can do it on your own time later. But once you've completed that, please share it with your friends and family and colleagues, because the more people that we can get contacting their federal MPs, the greater power that we have to get real change. And don't worry about saving that link. We'll also send it in some follow-up emails after this webinar, so you'll have it handy. So just to conclude, thank you everyone for coming out today, especially on a Friday afternoon. We really appreciate it. We know what needs to be done to save the swift parrot. We have the science, as Matt and Dean have discussed. We have a national recovery plan. Now we just need the people power to ensure that governments at all levels stop destructive practices like logging of swift parrot habitat, and that they implement the conservation actions and fund the recovery efforts that are laid out in that National Recovery Plan. So thank you everyone again for coming out today. I really think that we can and we will save swift parrots when we all act together, and I'll hand it back over to Fee. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Andrew. I might just throw it over to Erin. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes left. I know there's lots of questions in the chat box. I know we won't be able to get to them all. Sorry, everyone. Also looks like there's some chat going on between each other, which is always awesome. So any questions that you can throw out to the speakers, Erin, for the next 5 to 10 minutes?
Yeah, look, thank you so much, everybody. There are so many questions. We're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them, but just a couple. So we did over email as well. Maybe Matt, if you can just briefly talk to nesting boxes, because there was quite a bit of interest in nesting boxes and how they work, whether people can do them.
Yeah, so I mean, nest boxes are being used for all sorts of species these days, but for swift parrots and really probably most other species as well, but for swift parrots, they should really only be considered as sort of habitat augmentation. It's not replacement. The birds actually prefer, from all the boxes that have got that we've put up in Tasmania, the birds prefer natural hollows. The natural hollows fill up, and then they start spilling over into nest boxes. But so in targeted locations, they can be, they can still definitely be useful, but they're not a replacement. But also on top of it, a lot of people probably don't realise just how expensive nest boxes are. First of all, just to build ones that are suitable and that are going to last for at least some time, but maintaining them is incredibly labour intensive, time intensive. It's not the sort of thing that's going to fit into current conservation budgets.
So much better
at the scale that that maybe some people sort of imagine. It's more a very targeted sort of approach. They can be useful.
So much better to leave the trees standing rather than try and manufacture the habitat afterwards, from the sounds of it, Matt. Yeah. I mean,
in the sort of situations where they might be useful is where if natural hollows are limiting, but there's areas where there's high quality foraging habitat, and it's clear that there's more food available when that area flowers than there is hollows for birds to nest. That's an option. Then there's also identifying areas where, for example, sugar gliders are either not present or at lower densities and predation rates are lower. But it is definitely not something that should ever be considered in terms of an offset, or because it's not replacing like for like.
Great. All right. I might move on to another question now.
Erin, you've gone on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, Andrew. Thanks. Sorry, everyone. This is a question, a bit of a combo question for Dean, because there were quite a few questions that have come through about details about house swift parrots. live. But we had a great question from Mark that came in over the email as well. And then another question, a few other questions that have come through about how people can encourage or create habitat for swift parrots. And Mark in Sydney also emailed that they'd like to know whether birds visit the areas and where to spot them, and whether there's a map to show their flight direction and where they will be when, which I love the idea of a swift parrot timetable and route map. But Dean, maybe are you able to just talk briefly to what encourages swift parrots to an area and how we can know when they'll be there?
I mean, if you're going to do habitat restoration, it would be planting any of the trees that are identified in the recovery plan as a high priority, high value tree for a local area. So depending on which part of New South Wales or Sydney basin you're in, but things like spotted gumshaw, swamp mahoganies, even planted, ironbarks and yellow gums out of range can provide resources at the right time. In terms of where we expect them to turn up and when, that's kind of the $1 million question, even for the recovery team still. One thing that we are working on at the moment is redesigning our mainland monitoring program to try and get at that question a little bit more. So we've done 30 odd years worth of monitoring with an enormous amount of community volunteer input and assistance, which has given us the knowledge that we've got now, but they have started to, change what they're doing a little bit. So we're currently setting up a new program to try and standardise it a bit more, but also collect more habitat data to basically, potentially come up with a predictive tool that helps us work out when we might expect them to turn up in a region. I mean, the hard thing is with, potentially less than 2,000 birds now, yes, we've talked about times where they'll congregate in big numbers, but at times they can still be quite scattered as well. So, even in instances where we have great flowering along the South Coast spotted gum forest or coastal swamp mahogany, it's a bit hard to, point your finger at a spot on the map and say that they'll turn up there. It's really more about becoming a good ecologist, if you like, just starting to read the environment. What's happening in my area? Are things flowering? Am I seeing an increase in the number of little lorikeets and musk lorikeets and smaller honeyeaters? Are those changes happening? And on the mainland, if those things are happening during autumn and winter in the range of the swift parrot, then I'd be keeping my eyes and ears open, for the chance that they'll turn up.
Great, thanks, Dean. And I know we're at time. I'm just going to be a bit cheeky, Fee, and just throw in one more question because I'm in the campaigns team, and we had a few questions of this nature, which is just how we're going to stop the logging industry harvesting native forests. And we've heard a bit today about how that's really one of the main drivers of extinction, which is not a term that I really like, but essentially the removal of swift parrot habitat, the trees that they nest in, the trees that they feed in. Just while Dean was talking, Matt sent me a message saying that in Tasmania there's so little breeding habitat left that actually it is quite easy to predict where the birds are going to be there because there's just so few areas where they have left to go. So I'm going to take the host's privilege and answer this question myself, which is we really would love you to join the campaign. I know there's a lot of folk on the line today who are already doing an amazing amount of work on the South Coast and in Tasmania and other places to help protect habitat for swift parrot and other wildlife. So we'll pop that link up again. We'll be back in touch with specific actions for you to do in both New South Wales and Tasmania and nationally. It's a really critical year, not just until the end of this year, but into next, when we'll be seeing new legislation in Parliament to govern how we manage nature in Australia. So yeah, we'd really love you to join. Your voice really and how you can use it with politicians is one of the best tools that we have. Thanks. Back to you, Fee.
Awesome, thank you, and great wrap. We are at time. Thanks so much. The hour went so quickly. I wish we could have talked to everyone for so much longer. Thanks so much to Harriet and Oisin for calling in from the south coast of New South Wales. Thank you so much. And Matt, thanks so much for calling in from Tas. Hopefully all our borders will be open soon and we can go and visit each other, especially Tas. We miss you. And yeah, and thanks so much everyone. As both Erin and Andrew said, we'll be following up with links and actions, and also we'll try to address a lot of the questions that have come through in the chat box today. Before I jump off, does anyone, Erin?
I was just going to say, we might see if we can get a post up on the BirdLife Facebook page where we can try and post some of the answers to those questions there. So if you haven't already liked BirdLife on Facebook, maybe just head over there and we'll try and get that up later today or next week.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. And we hope to see you again soon for another one of these webinars. It's the first one that we've done here at BirdLife Australia. And I think today is just a tribute to how much of a success it is. So thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.